I am here with Joseph Bednarik. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me on Walking Inside Poems.
My pleasure. No better place to take a walk.
Yeah, man. And you chose a poem by Clemens Starck
I
from
did.
this wonderful book, Cathedrals and Parking Lots. I've been spending some time with this book and just really dig a lot of the poems in here. You picked one particular poem that I sort of resonate with as well,
Hmm.
because I am about to turn 69 years old myself, and this is called Some Random Thoughts on Turning 75. We'll get into that, but first, if you will, please give our guests a little bio, a little information about who you are.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity, first of all, to be here and to talk about Clem, a great poet. Uh, I have basically worked my entire professional life in literary publishing, in small nonprofit publishers, the last 27 years of which was at Copper Canyon Press, which is a nonprofit uh, very dedicated to the art of poetry. I also, in my spare time, do speaking engagements at Unitarian Universalist congregations. And one thing I love about doing that is being able to incorporate meaningful poems within a service. And that's part of my advocacy is getting soulful poems or poems that help somebody's heart out into the world. So that's a big piece of it for me. And I also, after I retired from Copper Canyon, I was invited to start teaching a philosophy class in this place called the Clemente course, which is a course that serves under, well, teaches under at teaches underserved people. Uh, and it's been fascinating. And I just assigned, you'll appreciate this, Genesis, the book Genesis, illustrated by R. Crumb. And
Oh my
it is,
God.
I
Oh,
know
that could get wild.
it does get wild. And it's very fascinating. I was handing out the text, and this young woman goes, "Oh my gosh, I could read this."
Well, I was going to ask you how you get people involved and interested in philosophy, but there's one way right there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, very cool. Well, uh, and you go by Joseph, not Joe,
I
or
do. Yeah, I prefer Joseph.
okay.
Thank you.
Joseph, again, thank you very much for being on. It's my pleasure to have you here, and we definitely want to talk about Clem Stark. But before we do,
Hmm.
I can't help it. I've got to ask you.
Uh-oh. I hear it's coming. Here it's coming.
This guy,
Yeah,
man,
yeah.
one of my favorite writers, one of my all-time favorite poets. You edited this edition.
I
What
did.
was it like? And we could really go far down the rabbit hole, so we'll try to keep it brief. What was it like being Jim Harrison's editor?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I, like you, huge fan. The story is that he was the writer that I encountered in my early 20s who just uh, blew my life wide open, my heart, my head, everything. And I was doubly fascinated by the fact that this man was alive because all I had been reading were dead people. But this man was somewhere in rural Michigan, and I was walking in the same country as he was, and it just was very powerful. Um, and I just started reading everything and getting very, very interested. And then I was hitchhiking across the country. I went through Livingston, Montana. I stopped at Clark City Press, which was a publishing house that had published some of his work. And I tried to weasel my way into a job there. The first letter I wrote after college was to Clark City Press, saying I will work for free. I just wanted to get close, right? They had a project there about the literary magazine that Jim and Dan Gerber and Tom McGuane had put together and Tom McGuane was the fiction editor. He wasn't really involved in it, but Dan and Jim did Sumac, and I had heard that they were doing an anthology of Sumac, and that as Clark City started to delaminate, that project sort of got off the table, and I just asked whether I could do it, and they agreed. And so I wound up working on Sumac Reader, and Jim very much appreciated the work, as did Dan. And our literary relationship really started there. I had written a letter or two to him that he responded to. And I think that he, you know, at, I got so weary of Jim Harrison as Jack Nicholson's buddy, or Jim Harrison is hanging out in Hollywood. It's like, you know what? I love the poems. And I think what he sensed is here was a person who really didn't care too much about the ego, but actually profoundly cared about the literary art that was so close to his heart. And so he called me at my first gig. I wasn't at Copper Canyon at that point. He called me and said, "Hey, I just signed a contract with Copper Canyon Press for my collected poems. Would you be willing to help me find someone to input the poems into a keyboard or into a computer disk?" He was not good at that, and I just said, "Can I apply for the job?"
I know a guy. Yeah.
I know a guy. And so this was Shape of the Journey, which was published in 98. And so, I was a young father at that time, and every poem that Jim Harrison had written to that point flew through these fingers on keyboard. And as part of the process, I checked all the known publications of the poem to see variants and mistakes. And I caught a bunch of weird stuff that he was very appreciative of. And I have somewhere a typescript signed to me. I printed out two typescripts, one for him, one for me, and he signed it. And it's, one of my holy texts. And from that point on, I think that he just recognized the purity of intent, I will say. Just I cared about the work. I cared about the work. And when we would work together, it was very serious. We wasted no time. We got down to work.
That,
And he would always take a break in midday, and we'd go on for a little drive or whatever. But very
I'm
much.
sure there was wine involved as well.
Yeah, there was, and sure, and good wine. And what I told him was, you're the artist. All decisions are your decisions. What I'm serving as is your last best reader. I'm not the best reader, but I'm just the last best reader. And and from that we were able to create a very trusting relationship. And it's probably one of my deepest friendships from a literary perspective, certainly. And I use that complete poems that you were showing me. I work. Yeah, great. Let's do another show on the complete poems. I would love it.
You bet. Oh, I'd love
Yeah.
to. I have an upcoming episode on a Jim poem with Tom Goddard.
Todd Goddard, yeah.
Todd Goddard, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm happy to have 3 or 4 episodes. As I said, he's absolutely one of my favorites. And folks watching this, if you don't know Copper Canyon Press, you need to. So many of the books on my shelf are Copper Canyon Press, and that volume here is a little pricey, but it's well worth it.
Now, don't say that. That volume, we fundraised a bunch to be able to keep that as low as possible.
Oh, it's an amazing book. Yeah. I'm
$40
sure
price point at that time. It's probably up now because
I think it's 50.
Probably 50.
Yeah. But well worth it.
Right.
Okay, well,
can I say one other thing about Jim Harrison?
Absolutely, please.
So first job in publishing, I encountered Clem Starck, blown away by Clem Starck, right? And I started working closely with Clem, and I'm like, God, I gotta get Jim to read Clem. And so I sent Jim a galley of Clem Starck's work, and Jim was just like, oh my God, where did this guy come from? So it's just so fun to be able to make a connection between two of my faves. So.
Yeah, that's great. And so again, the poem we're going to talk about comes from this book. Why don't I read the poem first? I'm going to ask you to read it at the end of this episode to take us out. But let me read it, and then let's talk a little bit about Clem, and then we'll get into the poem a little more specifically. Okay. Some random thoughts on turning 75. Clemens Starck. Snug in my little rat's nest of half-digested books and paper, a lifetime's cachet of memorabilia and junk. I peer out at the world with a quizzical eye, still trying to make sense of it. Of the various schemes for saving the planet, my choice is another ice age. What a big chill did for the dinosaurs could also work for the Republicans and other vestiges of reptilian mentality. Although I was for a time a dues-paying member of the International Hod Carriers, Building and Common Laborers Union of America, local number 435, I never actually carried a hod. And although I've been reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead aloud at my dying wife's bedside, as a skeptic, I'm not altogether sure this will help her. But under the circumstances, it can't hurt.
Goosebumps.
Why, this is maybe an obvious question, but See, I'm curious what you say. If I say, why did you choose that?
There's a variety of reasons. One, I just retired, and so there's that passageway or that threshold that I've just went through.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing I will say is that, I met Clem when I was in my 20s, at a reading. I didn't know him from a hole in the ground, and his reading just blew me away. And then I had the great good fortune of working with him at his on his first book. Um, and he was one of those guys, he was 25 years older than I was. So he essentially served as a person who was, you know, breaking trail for me. And I always watched, how he lived his life and what he was doing, because I felt that he had a life of deep integrity, was able to integrate the life, an artistic life, essentially an anonymous artistic life. He never got the due that he was due, you know, and also a labor. And so and he made a distinct decision in his 20s. He was going to Princeton. He dropped out of Princeton, wound up. I love this story. This is a classic Clem Starck story. He drops out of Princeton. He gathers together all of William Faulkner's books, puts them in a backpack, hitchhikes to New Orleans, gets a cheap hotel, and reads the entirety of Faulkner in chronological order.
Wow.
I mean, hello, you
Yeah.
know. I mean,
Yeah.
it was just, I mean, and he doesn't make a big deal of it, right? He's like, well, of course you have to do this if you want to live this life. And he was a merchant seaman, and he was, it was a carpenter for a long time. He wound up landing a gig at Oregon State University as a carpenter who was specialized in doors and windows. And so here he was in these overalls, coveralls, going around campus fixing stuff. Um, and then his first book comes out, Journeyman's Wages. His first book winds up winning the Oregon Book Award. It winds up winning a big booksellers award in the Pacific Northwest, the William Stafford Award. I've heard that you're doing the Stafford Challenge.
Yep.
Congratulations. Hope things are
Thank you.
going well.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
amazing. Yeah.
but And all of a sudden, his cover was blown. Then there was this big article in the Oregonian with Clem standing there, and all of a sudden, all these people in his workshop, or like maintenance shop, are like, "What? You're a what? You're a poet?"
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
well, yeah, I am. And he's a very serious poet. And his what I love is there's on the flyleaf of his book Cathedrals and Parking Lots, there's a blurb by a great American poet named Joseph Stroud, who says, I'm going to paraphrase it. It says,
I've got it if you want me to read it.
"Oh yeah, please read the sledgehammer part. That's just such a fantastic."
Okay. So Clem Starck is an American original, a unique voice and sensibility, and he's a master craftsman. Every poem is rock solid. If you hit any of them with a sledgehammer, the only things that would fly off would be sparks. Yeah.
That is the best blurb ever. I just love that blurb,
Great.
and
That's great.
he's so dead on. Um, and so Clem was, in my mind, a certifiable genius living in rural Oregon, writing incredible poems that, just a lot of people admired. Um, and he wound up, interestingly, there's a festival in Astoria, Oregon, an annual festival called Fisher Poets, where literary-minded people who are Fisher people, men and women, non-binary people, and they gather once a year for this festival. And it turns out that Clem was essentially the spiritual godfather for that, because the guy who founded it saw Clem at a reading, and Clem was reading his labor poems, his work poems. And the gentleman said, "Oh my goodness, we could do this. There is art here." And and so Clem was sort of like the leader there. He would go every year and pack the halls. And again, he was such a dynamic performer. And one little vignette I have to say, about 8, 9 years ago, he calls me, Clem does, and says, "Hey Joseph, I want to let you know that I put you in my will." I'm like, "Clem, what am I getting?" And he goes, "You and Charles," and a poet named Charles Goodrich, great poet from Oregon. "You and Charles are getting my library." At which point I said, "Clem, I'm not sure I want your library," because it was so huge. I mean, it was just, he was a carpenter, floor to ceiling, wall to wall bookcases
Uh-huh.
everywhere,
Yeah. Yeah.
stuff, triple stacked. It's like, oh yeah. And so I wound up saying, "Clem, how about this? I'll come down and we'll start culling the herd, right? And the books that you want to get rid of, I will make a decision whether I want to keep them or move them along.
Yeah.
And we did it about 3 or 4 times, and it was just such a joy to hang out with an elder,
Yeah.
again, a person who's running ahead of me,
Yeah.
and to watch his processing of a lifetime library. And because the world had changed, like when he was starting out as a poet, he needed to keep all those books because they went out of print and you couldn't find them. And I said, Clem, with the internet, you can find anything within
Anyway, yeah.
4 nanoseconds. And so it was very
We
fun.
still
I
like
told him,
we still like to collect books though.
oh, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Don't. Here I am. You know,
Yeah.
I've got thousands. So,
You know, I was a little surprised that it was Faulkner he chose,
mm,
just because his style
hmm
is definitely not a run-on sentence Faulkner style.
no, not at all. He's a very precise, very concise
Mhm.
poet. But he also a big curious mind is big and curious,
Yeah,
right?
it was
Big
an
curious
education.
mind take a lot in.
Yeah.
And my guess is he's a young man at that point. Faulkner's in the air in a huge way. He probably heard someone at Princeton say, "You got to read Faulkner." He's like, "Oh, okay, I'll read Faulkner," and went and read Faulkner. Um,
So I haven't read that many of his poems. My sense is that a lot of them are about labor, are about working with your hands, his carpentry work and other things. What percent is that? A huge percentage of the poems, or what would you
yeah, I
say?
would say. I'd probably say, probably an equal percentage to the amount of time you spend working is the amount of time that he is writing about work.
Yeah.
Um, work is a huge part of our lives, and he chose to make that very much a subject of his writing. And we find so much identity as I introduced myself as a co-publisher, right? That's what I led with in the United States. That's what we do. I'm a dentist. I'm a doctor. And I think for him, he always led with, I'm a carpenter. And then when it switched, I'm a poet, right? And it's a very powerful move there, I think. When you refer to yourself, when he started referring to himself as a poet, um, it was like you say, he was undercover for a long time. He wasn't in
Yeah.
literary.
In, in a very different way than Wallace Stevens. I know you've probably heard some of those
Oh,
stories about people at his insurance office saying, "Hey, Wally, did you know there's a poet, a famous poet with the same name as you?" And he would go, "Oh yeah, I think I've heard that. Yeah,
weird.
that's great."
Okay.
Okay, well let's. I think it's something we could talk about him for a long time. Such a fascinating guy. And by the way, folks, there are a number of videos available on YouTube if you want to see the man himself reading. I saw a couple of really interesting ones that you pretty quickly get an idea. This was a charismatic, dynamic guy for sure.
Yeah.
So, how about this poem? Snug in my little rat's nest. One of the things I noticed right away that I don't know, maybe a stretch, is when we think of rats and we think of books and paper, we think of rats maybe eating those books and paper. And here he says, snug in my little rat's nest of half digested books and papers. I thought that
No.
was kind of an interesting little move. But yeah, we those of us who do collect books have a lot of half digested books, don't we?
We sure
Uh,
do.
a
Hey,
lifetime. Yeah, please.
one of the things I have to say is I just got back from Clem's house. Clem died last March,
Yes.
and so I've been going down as part of the transition to as part of the transition. I just spent 4 days in his library, and it's an accurate description of Rat's Nest. I mean, his place was filled with material,
Uh-huh.
and very well organized. So Rat's Nest doesn't really speak to his organizational principles, but you definitely get a sense of he created a fort, you know,
Mhm.
surrounded by books in
Mhm.
his study, and that he's peering out from that place.
Yes.
I think is fantastic. And in that first stanza, one of the things I loved was the comparison of memorabilia and junk, right? And he has them on 2 lines. And what is
Yes. Right.
memorabilia? Memorabilia are those objects that contain memory, right?
That
And
means
what
something to us.
exactly? And what is junk? Well, junk is junk.
It's
What's
junk.
interesting is that he's got both in his room. So he makes the distinction between the two, but
Yeah.
for some
Yeah.
reason the junk's still there.
Of course, one man's memorabilia is another man's junk too. So it could also, in a way, be saying, "Hey, you might think it's junk," but yeah, I agree. I love this. I peer out at the world, almost like he's in his little nest, like a bird peering out at the world from a nest, with a quizzical eye, still trying to make sense of it. At 75, still trying to make sense of the world, and
Yeah, and I thought that that was a
it's
very powerful statement. There's a poem in his first book where he talks about taking a nap after reading a book, and he's like, how, and I'm going to paraphrase again, like, how is it that I can read all this stuff, but it just vanishes? It just goes away. This is a lot of work to read these books. And what are they doing? And I think that, he was in search of, well, he was an artist. He was also in search of wisdom. He was in search of reasons to be on the planet, as we all do. And he had an incredibly active mind, and it makes sense that he hasn't figured it out, because there might be nothing to figure out, right? It's all might just be process, and that he's in the process, and that maybe at one point in his life he thought that there would be an it to get to, and it might be the case that no, you're always digesting these books, and they're always going to be half.
You bet. And I'm trying to do the math here. I was just trying to look up. He must have been late 80s when he died.
Yeah, he was born, I think 37. So I think
Okay, and he just died last year.
Correct.
And so he turned 75 in what about 2013, something like that.
Sorry, I'm not gonna pretend to do the math that fast.
Well, I was just trying to think of, the next stanza starts getting into Republicans, and just thinking about what was happening during this time and trying to make sense of the world. I think if you stopped there, it's just a broad idea of someone in their older age still trying to make sense of the world. But then you go to that next verse, and it's pretty easy to make the leap to, I can't figure out what the fuck is going on in this world.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that what's interesting, that stanza, I think for me, is a problematic stanza. I don't think that Clem did not, to my mind, Clem did not write successfully angry poems, right? Successfully angry political poems. There are a couple that he showed me during his life, and I was like, keep that one in the file. But he was a laborer for his whole life. He was a progressive Democrat, and I think it doesn't really matter when the Republicans that he's referring to, because he lived through Nixon, he lived through Reagan, he lived through Bush 1, Bush 2. He saw the Iraq War. Yep. He had strong opinions about the leadership, and he didn't like what he saw. So
yeah, and this is pretty strong. I mean, saving the planet. Let's all die off in an ice age. I sort of relate to that, but the line here that
which isn't scientifically inaccurate. Like, one is going to come again, right? Yeah. We're not going to be hanging around for the rest of eternity on this planet.
We might not make it to that ice age, but yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. But the line that's just kind of a dagger here is for the Republicans and other vestiges of reptilian mentality.
Right.
That's an angry line right there.
That is an angry line. That is an angry line.
Yeah.
I didn't choose it for its anger.
Was he involved at all politically? Was he? He's a labor guy, but I don't picture him being sort of a. I'm blanking on his name. The banjo playing labor songwriter, Pete Seeger. I don't picture him being a Pete Seeger type of guy. Was he active at all politically?
He would not that I'm aware of. I mean, as I was hanging out in his office, I would find progressive leaflets and things like that. But I don't think he was a big sign waver. I didn't see any political signs or bumper stickers on his trucks, so I think he probably kept it pretty tight to the vest. Partly is you're living in rural Oregon, right? And you want to be friends with everybody. He's got some very powerful poems about neighbors and fences. Not Frost-esque, but and those neighbors are likely Republicans.
Yep.
So you want to keep it tight. You want to keep it respectful.
Amen.
And you can have your disagreements, and you can also choose to be good neighbors. And
Mhm.
I think that's probably where he landed on that.
Mm.
So,
One
one
thing
thing
I like,
I'm
go
going to
ahead.
say, one thing I noticed about this poem, reading it in preparation for today's discussion, four stanzas. The first stanza for me is like literary pursuits, right? Second stanza, he touches on politics. Third stanza, it's about work and labor. And fourth stanza, you just go right into the most intimate place you could possibly be in your home. And so that's one of the things that, what I think makes the poem, and especially a Clem Starck poem, so good is all of this stuff is swirling around and it comes right down, right down
Yep.
to it,
Yep.
you know? So,
Yeah, for sure. That's something that I'm finding as I'm diving into more and more poems. I'm finding really attractive to me as well. There's this sense of, wait, where did that come from? And then, oh, here's this, but there is in some way it follows, and that's not easy to do without just sounding completely random. But he did call it some random thoughts. So
and
fair
that's
enough. We have four different stanzas, four different approaches to thinking about things.
and thank you for catching that because there is nothing random about Clemens Stark. Zero. And that he actually titled the poem
Yeah.
Random Thoughts. It's like,
Yeah.
Clem, you don't have a random bone in your body. What are you talking about?
Well, I read that as these are not. These are four different, as you pointed out, four different, very very different topics. So
Okay.
random in the sense that, hey, I'm not coming at you with a poem about X. It's
Mm,
about X, it's about Y, it's about Z, and it's about D.
no.
Um, anyway, uh, I love this third stanza. The humor is really great. Although I was for a time a dues-paying member of the International Hod Carriers Build. I had to look up Hod, by the way. I didn't know that
What'd you
term.
find? What'd you discover for our listeners out there who don't know
Well,
what a hood is?
I may not have it exact, but a hod carrier is one who carries a bricklayer's materials. I get the impression that they're almost like an apprentice to a bricklayer, and they're carrying the materials for them back and forth. And I guess a hod is something they carry it on.
Right, a hod is that sort of
Yes,
V-shaped
that's right.
thing with the pole that
Yeah,
it's an
yeah,
ancient tool.
yeah. Although I was for a time a dues-paying member of the International Hod Carriers Building and Common Laborers Union of America, local number 435. Nice little detail. I never actually carried a hod. Uh,
Oh, yeah, the thing I love about that stanza, again, is that sort of funneling from
ah,
note how he does the lines
mhm,
of the international line break.
mhm.
Then it's the name of the union, line break of America. So he's
Line break. Yeah,
sandwiching international and America, and then he goes one step further, local number 435. Just,
yeah.
again, it's just he's stepping down, and he's preparing us really for I think the final
Yeah.
stanza, that
What
final.
what do you make of I never actually carried a hod? Other than it's kind of humorous. It's kind of like saying, "Oh, I had a dude, but I never actually carried a hod." But I think there's a lot more to it than that. What do you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that what is it? He is a member of a union of these kinds of laborers. That's not a kind of labor that he did. Nonetheless, he was labeled as such, right? Um, I think that uh, I want to believe that line does speak more to humor than anything
Yeah,
else.
yeah,
And I think it's a nice relief, and it's a nice release, a humorous release before we do step into that final stanza, because I think that there's a when people laugh, when people smile, there's an openness that happens, and so he's setting us up, I think, to be open for this final thing. He's been angry, the Republicans and the reptilian vestiges,
yeah.
and now it's kind of reflecting and being a little bit funny, joke at
And
work.
and maybe a little bit humble in a sense that, hey, I don't want to misrepresent myself. I was a member, but I didn't actually carry a hod.
Right, right.
Yeah,
He did
and
a
then
lot though. He
and then
carried
the
a lot.
home run, then the home run, and although I've been reading the Tibetan Book of Dead, and another interesting line right there, aloud at my dying wife's bedside as a skeptic. I mean, just already right there, chills. As a skeptic, I'm not altogether sure this will help her, but under the circumstances, it can't hurt.
Mhm.
Oh, it does hurt.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
does hurt.
his wife was Barbara was a practicing Tibetan Buddhist and very high in the mind person. They had a very interesting relationship. Um, two brilliant people living in the converted farmhouse. And she was dying, and before she died, she wound up suffering from Alzheimer's. And so he got to watch his wife slowly disappear, and it was agony for him.
Yeah.
And a book, small chapbook about another poet's wife dying of Alzheimer's, and it's dedicated to Clem. So there's like this very intense sort of engagement with watching a beloved slowly leave, um, and so there's a great poem in the book called Misha that I highly recommend you reading, where he winds up focusing all of his grief. I mean, apparently he couldn't cry when his wife died, and so it was sort of bottled up inside him. And then some period of time later, his cat died, Misha, and he said just it exploded everything, and grief was, you just flop down on the floor.
Well, why don't I read that poem real quickly?
Oh, sure, that'd be great.
I
Misha.
mean, we're running close on time, but we got a few more minutes.
Right on.
Misha, under the house is where I found him huddled, barely alive, a bundle of soft white fur, emitting one last feeble meow as I crawled toward him. This is how Misha died. My cat, my little pal. 9 lives, they say, and so I thought by stroking him and talking to him, murmuring his name over and over again, maybe I could love him back to life. It didn't work. This must have been his ninth. While he lay dying on the hearth beside the wood stove next to me, I finally dozed off and dreamt that he had come alive, miraculously leaping up and scampering around the room. My son was with me in the dream, and together we tried stopping him, afraid he might harm himself or disappear. But then, without speaking, we both realized he had already left his body. This was his spirit passing through on its way out the open window. It's good to have a cat, even better to have a son. Oh, man. Woo!
Right. And when you know the
Yeah.
backstory on that, it's just even more powerful. It's
Yeah.
even more powerful.
Yeah.
So, no, he's great. Thank you for that reading. Beautiful.
You
Beautiful.
bet. Well, Joseph, is before I ask you to read our poem to take us out today, is there anything else you would like to say about Clem or anything else?
Yeah, the one thing I would like to say about Clem is when I heard he was dying, he called all of his friends. I drove down to meet him, and I just had to do this. I put my hands on his shoulder. I said, "Clem, you just got to look me in the eye." And we just stood there, and I said, "I love you." And he said, "I love you." And it was just one of those things that I had to do. And then the month that he was dying, he applied for and received the clearance for death with dignity in Oregon. So he was going to go get his medicine, as he called it. And I said, "Clem, when are you gonna take that medicine?" And he's like, "Well, when it arrives." I was like, "Really? You're not gonna hang on to it? You're not gonna wait?" He's like, "Why?" I was like, "Oh, I got to come down again." So I went back down again, and it turns out some other great poets were coming down. Red Pine was a translator, great Chinese translator, a guy named Finn Wilcox, and another great great poet and outdoor advocate, Tim McNulty. They were coming down as well to pay their homage and say goodbye. And I was leaving, and they hadn't arrived yet. And Clem's like, "Hey, come back," because I was gonna go do a little visit somebody. Come back when the guys are here. I was, I'd like to see you back here. And so I came back, and they were all sitting around the table, and it was just like, oh man, wow, just Clem was holding court at the end of the table, and I said I couldn't stay. I just had to leave. So I just got up and I just said, "Clem, your poems are in here. Turn, walk away," and I just bawled in my car. So
That's really beautiful, man. Thank
good
you
man.
for sharing that. I
Good man.
really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, would you read this poem to take us out?
With pleasure. Thank you very much for the invite, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Some random, and it's always difficult to read a Clem Starck poem because you know his spirit's hanging around saying you're reading it wrong, dude. Some random thoughts on turning 75. Snug in my little rat's nest of half-digested books and paper, a lifetime's cache of memorabilia and junk, I peer out at the world with a quizzical eye, still trying to make sense of it. Of the various schemes for saving the planet, my choice is another ice age. What a big chill did for the dinosaurs could also work for the Republicans and other vestiges of reptilian mentality. Although I was for a time a dues-paying member of the International Hod Carriers Building and Common Laborers Union of America, local number 435, I never actually carried a hod. And although I've been reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead aloud at my dying wife's bedside, as a skeptic, I'm not altogether sure this will help her. But under the circumstances, it can't hurt. And that last line, it can't hurt, it's like bang, bang, bang. You know, you just hear the hammer in that, or I do.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you again, Joseph, for doing this. And I think I'm going to take you up on that offer to have an episode. I never contemplated having an episode on multiple poems. The idea behind this is just one poem per episode, but I think it'd be really cool to do an episode on this in general. We could read some of the poems from it. You could talk about putting it together. We could talk about Jim Harrison. So if you're up for it, down the road, I'd love to do that.
Absolutely.
All right.
Your favorite. Happy to do it.
All right, man. Thank you so much for doing this. Wish you best. Take care.